Look, Alan Dershowitz is a great defense lawyer for guilty clients.
Well, I wish Zogby would be a little bit more original. I mean, he's been making this charge now for, 5 years? At least let him come up with something original.
And you hear some of the verbal fireworks between James Zogby and Alan Dershowitz. It's not fireworks, rockets. And return fire now, the Gaza Strip and Israel plunged into conflict. Will it get worse? To shed some light on the subject and to discuss this in civil fashion, we welcome back to the program, jointly now, Harvard Law professor and legal analyst Alan Dershowitz joining us by phone, and via Skype, James Zogby of the Arab American Institute. Gentlemen, we thank you both for joining us, and we are treating this as a structured debate. You will have 1 minute each to respond to the questions I pose. We are keeping track of the time, and we will adhere to that time. Let's begin now with this debate. Israel's response to rocket attacks has been immediate. Some call it immense. There are reports now that Hamas is seeking some sort of relief from this onslaught. James, to you first. Did the Palestinians underestimate the degree of the Israeli response?
I think that there's no question that they should have expected it if they didn't. And if they didn't, they're dumber than I expected them to be. I think that the rocket fire was inexcusable from the beginning. It probably wasn't Hamas that started. I think it was other groups, but Hamas certainly got into it after a time, especially after they saw hundreds of their leaders and cadre in the West Bank being arrested. They responded. But the response was stupid. It was basically picking a fight they couldn't win. But I think, as I've said in the previous time I was on the show with you, Israel was stupid as well, because it's a fight that they can't win. We've done this now 5 times in the last 9 years, and every time it ends up the same way. No winners and a lot of losers, in particular Palestinians who die by the hundreds by the time it's over. It's a disaster, and frankly, it never should have started.
And that minute given to James. Now to you, Alan, your response to what Mr. Zogby had to say.
Well, Israel abandoned the Gaza and gave up all the settlements in the hope of really achieving peace. It left behind agricultural hothouses. The Palestinians could have built Singapore on the Mediterranean. There was no siege, and then Hamas started firing rockets. Then the siege began. And any democracy, of course, has to respond to rockets being fired at its cities. Hamas commits a double war crime when it fires rockets, because it fires them from very, very crowded centers. It fires them from hospitals, fires them from schools, using Palestinians as human shields, hoping that Israel will then respond and kill Palestinians. They are then ready with their television cameras to show the dead Palestinians, who are completely the fault of Hamas. Hamas built shelters only for its fighters, not for its civilians. Israel built shelters only for its civilians. So the fault is 100% with Hamas for starting a fight. They can't win, but they define win differently. If they kill some Israeli civilians, that is a victory for them, even if it means 100 Palestinians die in the process. Your minute
is up, Alan. James, sure. Hopefully we cleared up any audio problem you may have had. Now I want to take you back. You offered your evaluation of this conflict last time you joined us. I want to play a portion of what you said. Let's take a listen.
Hamas doesn't get it, that violence is not going to end the occupation. But Israel doesn't get it either, and that is that more violence from their side isn't going to end the resistance to the occupation.
In fact, James, you reiterated that earlier. Alan, I want to get your reaction to that observation from James, and then we'll hear from James Zogby again. Professor Dershowitz.
Well, it's 100% wrong. Violence in the name of protecting one's citizens is not only justified, but every democracy would do it. If rockets were being fired at Miami Beach or at New York City, the United States would try to target those who were sending the rockets. What makes it very difficult for Israel is that Hamas calls for human shields to go on the roof of buildings that are being used to fire rockets. That puts Israel to the choice of allowing its own citizens to be put in harm's way or attacking the rockets and thereby possibly killing. Now, they give every possible warning they can. They send leaflets, they make phone calls, they send noise bombs. But if the Hamas is determined to put civilians in harm's way, there will tragically be civilian deaths. There's now a lawsuit in Israel trying to get the Israelis to not send messages, but just to go after the targets. That lawsuit will lose. Israel will have to use some degree of military force.
And I have to stop you right there. Thank you, Professor. James Zogby, your response.
When I said that Alan tries to defend the indefensible, that's a classic example of what we just heard. Look, I can agree that Hamas throwing these rockets at Israel with no sense of where they're going to go and what the targets will be is immoral. But you have to understand that Israel doing what it does and what it does before the rockets started, the fact that Gaza is the most densely populated place on earth, that it's one of the poorest places on earth, that people in Gaza have been strangled by a horrific blockade now for almost a decade, and it is a place of hopelessness and despair and seething anger. And so the issue here is that Israel can't absolve itself as the most moral society because it defends its own people, while it is at the same time oppressing brutally another people. And so the issue here is that there really
we
are
have to stop you right there,
guys.
James. Thank you. We're going to keep this exactly to a minute. We're going to continue to talk about what has happened in terms of these attacks. The Palestinian death toll, we're told, edges close to 100 today. Included in those casualties, 14 children. The rockets launched by the Gaza militants into Israeli citizens as of yet have not produced comparable casualties among children. Alan, you touched on this earlier. Seeing children in this is heartrending. What is your take again on what is transpiring with the deaths of children?
Well, Golda Meir once said, we can perhaps forgive our enemies for killing our children. We can never forgive them for making us kill their children. They put their children on the roofs. They put their rockets in hospitals, and you can't expect Israel to ignore that. Mostly it doesn't fight back. Also, I have to correct James. Gaza is not nearly as densely populated as New York City or Chicago. It's not even close, and it's much, much wealthier than the adjoining areas of Egypt. Gaza could have been a paradise. Israel left it. There was no siege. It completely abandoned it. Gaza and Hamas could have built a wonderful society. Instead, they chose Israel, and those rockets require a response. Every democracy would respond. Israel takes more efforts to prevent civilian casualties than any country in the history of warfare. But when you're dealing with a group that uses human shields, inevitably you're going to find some children killed. That's the great tragedy.
We thank you for that. Now, James Zogby, your response.
Alan, it's just not true. Israel invents these arguments in order to absolve itself of the killing of innocent people. There were no warnings sent when people were watching the World Cup and were bombed in the middle of the game. There were no warnings sent when a family last night was sound asleep and almost all of them were murdered in an attack on their home. You know, we've learned here in America there are no such things as smart bombs, and militaries may try to defend themselves, but at the end of the day, it's brutal murder and it's terrorism from the sky. It's a highly technologized form of terrorism, and it's no different than a suicide bomber. This is just fundamentally wrong. And as long as you try to absolve the Israelis and invent moral arguments to say they're more moral than the other guys, you ultimately put yourself on the side of those who are committing that murder. I'm not going to take either side because both are wrong, but the oppressor does bear special responsibility, especially when they are the occupier.
I'm going to have to stop you there, James. To get some more give and take, Alan, another minute for you to respond, then we'll let James conclude.
Okay, what James is doing is accusing the United States, Britain, every Western country of murder. The United States, of course, has used smart bombs in Afghanistan. They've killed many civilians. By the way, many, many, many more civilians than Israeli has. and the United States does not give as adequate warnings as Israel does. So you can't accuse a country of murder when it's trying to defend its own citizens. That's just extreme rhetoric. What you can accuse them of, perhaps, is maybe using disproportionate force. It's not disproportional force. Hamas is trying to bomb school buses. It's trying to bomb hospitals. It's trying to bomb ambulances. So far, it's failed due to American support for Israel and the American and Israeli-built systems that prevent the rockets from hitting. If Hamas were to build shelters and allow their citizens to go underground, there would be many, many fewer casualties. If they would spend their money building shelters instead of building rockets, or even building farms instead of building rockets, Hamas, remember, was not under siege.
And James Zogby, thank you, Alan. To James for your final minute here in this segment. Go ahead, James.
Alan, Israel didn't end the occupation when it left Gaza. It simply created a prison out of Gaza by having it locked in on all sides. Number one.
Not true.
Number
that
two,
happened years later.
Let him say
that happened years later. That's not true. That's just factually a mistake.
Please.
Alan, let James have his say. Go ahead, James.
Thank you, JD. The issue here is that Israel is the occupier, and Israel is the disproportionate oppressor. I am not going to defend Hamas's behavior, but I simply cannot understand how you can defend Israel. You are a civil rights attorney, and yet they are holding hundreds of people without charges on administrative detention, without charges, without trial. They've used torture. They've confiscated land illegally and built settlements. They have engaged in a whole range of activities that are themselves immoral. And yes, I don't find any great joy or pride in the American behavior in Iraq or the British behavior in the many wars they fought.
And
but that you can defend Israel's behavior
we'll have
in
to
Gaza,
stop you right there, James. We're trying to keep this even-handed in terms of the debate. We will continue, James Zogby, Alan Dershowitz, this debate on America's Forum, coming right back.